On Halloween night in 1923, Sarah Blackwood had her seventh baby under a blood-red moon. The baby boy had a birthmark that scared the midwife so much she dropped her tools and ran into the dark. She refused to take any money and never talked about what she saw. Before we get into the story, quick question. What's the scariest case you've ever heard about or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe. We're building a group of truth seekers who aren't afraid of scary things. Now let's continue with the story. The Blackwood Hollow sat tucked between two mountains in eastern Tennessee. You could only get there by a narrow dirt road that turned to mud when it rained even a little. 6 children already lived in the old farmhouse. Their ages were from 14 down to 3. Sarah had carried each pregnancy easily, having healthy babies with only Granny Kate's experienced hands to help them into the world. But this 7th pregnancy felt different from the start. Sarah woke most nights covered in sweat, scared by dreams she couldn't quite remember. But that left her shaking until morning. The baby moved in strange patterns, sometimes staying perfectly still for days, then moving so hard that Jonathan would press his rough hand to her swollen belly and whisper prayers. Their farm animals became nervous as her due date got closer. The chickens stopped laying eggs, the cow's milk turned sour overnight. Granny Kate arrived 3 days before Halloween. Her wrinkled face looked serious as she checked Sarah in the dim lamplight. The old woman had delivered babies in these mountains for 50 years. She had seen babies born bottom first and babies born dead and twins tangled together. But something about Sarah's condition bothered her deeply. When's this baby due? Granny Kate asked, though she already knew. Halloween night. As far as I can tell, Sarah replied, adjusting herself on the bed. The midwife's hand stopped on Sarah's belly. A 7th child born on Halloween carries a burden, she said quietly. Old folks say such children stand between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The veil is thinnest that night, and sometimes things slip through that shouldn't. Sarah laughed, though the sound had no joy. You don't believe in such superstitions, do you? I've seen things in these mountains that would turn your hair white, Granny Kate said. Seen babies born with veils who could see the dead. Seen twins who shared dreams across miles. The world is stranger than we admit during the day. Jonathan dismissed the warnings as mountain stories, the kind of tales old women told to pass long winters. But as October 31st arrived, even he couldn't ignore the unnatural silence that settled over the hollow. No cricket songs, no owl calls, just a heavy stillness that pressed against the windows like something waiting to be invited inside. Labor began just after sunset. Sarah's water broke while she was setting the table for supper, and within an hour, the contractions came hard and fast. Granny Kate sent the other children to stay with neighbors, wanting them far from the house for reasons she couldn't quite explain. As midnight got closer, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. Frost formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning in the fireplace. And when the church bell in the valley below rang 12 times, Sarah Blackwood's 7th child came into the world without a single cry. His eyes wide open and staring at something no one else could see. Granny Kate held the newborn under the lamp light. Her old hand shook as she turned the child to look at him. The baby's skin had a healthy pink color, his arms and legs perfectly formed, his breathing steady and strong. By all measures, he looked normal. Then she saw the mark. On his left shoulder blade, dark as a bruise but clearly shaped, was a birthmark that looked exactly like an upside-down cross. The symbol stood out against his pale skin so clearly that it looked burned on rather than born. Sweet mercy, Granny Kate whispered, nearly dropping the baby. Sarah, tired and pale from the hard labor, reached for her son. What is it? What's wrong? The midwife backed toward the door, still holding the baby, her eyes wide with something beyond just fear. This child has the mark. I've heard of it in stories passed down from my grandmother, but never thought I'd see it myself. Give me my baby, Sarah demanded, trying to sit up. Jonathan moved between them, his face tight with confusion and growing anger. What mark? What are you talking about? Granny Kate finally handed the baby to Sarah, then immediately began gathering her supplies with shaking hands. A 7th child born at midnight on Halloween with that mark brings darkness to his family. It's written in the old ways in the warnings our ancestors left us. Sarah held her son protectively, looking at the birthmark herself. It did look unusual, she had to admit, but surely it meant nothing. It's just a birthmark. Children are born with them all the time. Not like that one. Granny Kate tied her shawl with fumbling fingers. I won't take payment for this delivery. Consider my debt to your family paid in full. But listen to my words, Sarah Blackwood. Get help from Reverend Stone. Have the child blessed before the week is out. There are forces in this world that wait for moments like this when the veil tears and something can slip through into our world. She left before either parent could respond, practically running down the porch steps into the frozen night. They heard her wagon rattle away at a speed that seemed dangerous for a woman her age, traveling dark mountain roads. Jonathan lit another lamp and looked at his newborn son carefully. The baby stared back at him with alert, intelligent eyes that seemed too aware for something only minutes old. When Jonathan's shadow fell across the baby's face, the baby didn't blink or flinch, just continued that unsettling stare. We should name him Silas, Sarah said softly, running her finger along the baby's tiny hand. After your father, Silas Blackwood, Jonathan repeated, testing the name. He wanted to dismiss Granny Kate's warnings as the crazy talk of a superstitious old woman. but he couldn't shake the memory of that unnatural silence before the birth, or the way frost had formed inside their home, or how their rooster had died that very morning with no visible cause. The baby wrapped his small fingers around Sarah's thumb with surprising strength. Outside, something screamed in the woods, a sound like nothing Jonathan had ever heard in 20 years of living in these mountains. It rose and fell almost like laughter, then cut off suddenly. Sarah pulled Silas closer to her chest, suddenly cold despite the fire. "Maybe we should talk to the Reverend," she whispered, "just to be safe." But Jonathan was already at the window, staring into the darkness, wondering what had made that sound, and why it had stopped the moment his son gripped his mother's hand. The first chicken died 3 weeks after Silas came home. Jonathan found it in the chicken house at dawn, lying on its side with no visible injuries. By the end of that week, 4 more followed, each one perfectly whole, yet completely dead, as if something had simply reached in and switched them off. The pattern continued as Silas grew. When he was 6 months old and beginning to crawl, a circle of Sarah's prized tomato plants died overnight, forming a perfect ring around the spot where she'd laid a blanket for him in the garden. When he turned 1, their best egg-laying hen stopped making eggs entirely, though it had been healthy and productive for 3 years. Ruth, now 15, noticed things the others missed or chose to ignore. She watched her baby brother from doorways and around corners, keeping track of the strangeness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Silas rarely cried, even as a baby. He slept with his eyes partly open, the whites gleaming in the darkness of the nursery. And animals, they reacted to him with pure instinct. The family cat would hiss and run away whenever Silas entered a room. The hunting dog that had been loyal to the Blackwoods for 8 years refused to come within 10 feet of the child, hair raised and teeth showing. Even the birds seemed to avoid the trees nearest the house. By the time Silas reached 3 years old and began speaking in full sentences, his siblings had developed a shared ritual. Every Sunday night, the 5 oldest children would gather in the barn after their parents went to bed, comparing the dreams that had bothered them throughout the week. I saw him again. Thomas, the eldest at 17, admitted one cold November evening. Same as before, standing at the foot of my bed, but wrong somehow twisted. His face was different in mine. 2-year-old Margaret whispered, longer, and his eyes were black all the way through. Ruth hugged herself against the chill. I dreamed he was calling something out of the woods, using words I've never heard before, in a voice that wasn't his own. The dreams had started when Silas was 2, affecting each sibling differently, but carrying the same underlying fear. They would wake gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, unable to shake the feeling that their brother was somehow present in their nightmares, watching them from behind those wrong eyes. During the day, Silas seemed like any other child. He played with wooden toys, helped feed the chickens that still survived, and followed Ruth around the house like a devoted puppy. But there were moments when something else looked out from behind his face. Sarah refused to see it. She defended her youngest son fiercely, blaming the farm animal deaths on disease and the dead crops on bad soil. When Ruth tried to talk to her about the dreams, Sarah silenced her with a sharp word and a sharper look. "How's your brother?" Sarah would say. "He's innocent. All of this is just coincidence and superstition." But Jonathan had started drinking. He'd come home from working the tobacco fields and go straight for the jar he kept hidden in the barn, emptying it before supper. Ruth found him there one evening, staring at nothing, the empty jar hanging from his fingers. "Your mother made a choice," he said without looking at Ruth. "During the pregnancy, when she thought she might lose him, she prayed to anything that would listen. I told her not to, but she wouldn't listen." He finally met Ruth's eyes, and she saw something broken behind them. "Something answered," he whispered. Reverend Meisha Stone arrived on a grey morning in March of 1928, called by a group of worried neighbors who had watched the Blackwood family's isolation deepen over the years. The Reverend was a tall man with kind eyes and hands scarred from his previous life as a coal miner before God called him to ministry. Sarah greeted him coldly at the door, her jaw set with stubbornness. "We don't need spiritual help for a healthy child. Then there's no harm in a simple blessing," the Reverend replied gently. "Let me ease your neighbor's concerns, if nothing else." Jonathan, hollow-eyed and thinner than he'd been months before, nodded from his chair by the fireplace. "Let him do it, Sarah. Maybe it will help." Silas played quietly in the corner with a set of wooden blocks, building towers and knocking them down with the focused intensity of a 5-year-old. He looked up when the Reverend entered, studying the man with that unnervingly direct gaze that made visitors uncomfortable. Reverend Stone opened his Bible and began reading from Psalms, his voice steady and confident. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching as her breath became visible in the suddenly freezing air. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Silas stood slowly, his blocks forgotten, his head tilted at an odd angle like a bird looking at prey. The Reverend continued reading, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Ikas sirof sensuethge verstap etnaim hatedel elusiam terosa Silas said clearly, his voice perfectly copying the Reverend's rhythm, but speaking the words backward, as if playing a recording in reverse. Sarah gasped. Jonathan stood suddenly, his chair falling to the floor. Reverend Stone's hands trembled, but he pressed forward. "Yeah, Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Live on Riaflu I had ted fo wodas et for yelavagort cloy got a. Silas responded. The voice coming from Silas no longer sounded entirely like the child. It had layers that shouldn't exist in a human throat, multiple sounds at once. The Reverend raised his hand to make the sign of the cross over the boy. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, I bless this child and cast out any darkness that. The Bible in his hands burst into flames. Not slowly, not with smoke or warning, but instantly, as if the pages had been soaked in gasoline and touched with a match. The Reverend dropped it with a cry of pain, watching in horror as the holy book burned with an unnatural blue flame that turned it to ash in seconds. Silas smiled, and for just a moment his shadow on the wall behind him moved on its own, stretching toward the ceiling with reaching fingers that ended in claws. Reverend Stone stumbled backward, crossing himself repeatedly, his lips moving in silent prayer. He grabbed his coat and ran without another word, leaving the smell of sulfur and burned leather hanging in the air. Sarah sank to her knees, staring at her son, who had returned to his blocks as if nothing had happened. Jonathan pressed his back against the wall, his face drained of all color. "What are you?" he whispered. Silas looked up with innocent eyes. "I'm your son, Papa." Word of what happened with Reverend Stone spread through the mountain communities like wildfire. The preacher himself refused to speak of it directly, but his hands still had burned scars, and his eyes carried a haunted look that told its own story. Within weeks, the Blackwood family found themselves completely shunned. Neighbors who had borrowed tools and traded goods for 2 generations now crossed the road when they saw Jonathan coming. The general store owner in the valley served them quickly and without conversation, his eyes fixed on the counter. Children who had once played with the Blackwood siblings were kept indoors when any member of the family appeared. Thomas left first just after his 20th birthday in 1929. He packed a single bag and walked out before dawn without saying goodbye, leaving only a note that read, "I can't stay in this house anymore. Forgive me." Margaret followed 6 months later, accepting a job as a house servant for a family 3 counties away. Then came James, then Lynn, each finding reasons to escape the suffocating dread that had settled over their home like fog. By 1931, only Ruth remained with her parents and Silas. Jonathan spent most days in the barn, coming out only for meals he barely touched. The jars multiplied, hidden in increasingly careless places. His hands shook constantly now, and he spoke to himself in low mutters that Ruth couldn't quite make out. Sarah had transformed into someone Ruth barely recognized. Her mother's eyes held a desperate brightness, her devotion to Silas intensifying as everything else crumbled. She sewed him new clothes, baked him special treats, sang him lullabies long past the age when such things were appropriate. "He's a good boy," Sarah would insist to no one in particular. "He's my sweet boy." But Ruth saw the cracks in her mother's certainty. She noticed how Sarah flinched when Silas entered a room unexpectedly, how she made the sign of the cross when she thought no one was watching, how she kept a small bottle of holy water hidden in her apron pocket, though she never quite worked up the courage to use it. Ruth stayed because someone had to bear witness. Someone had to remember. She began keeping a diary, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, writing down everything with careful precision. November 3rd, 1931, she wrote one evening by candlelight. Silas predicted Mrs. Henderson's death at breakfast. Said she would fall down her stairs before sunset. Mama told him not to say such awful things. Mrs. Henderson's daughter found her at the bottom of a staircase 3 hours later. Silas showed no surprise when we heard the news. The incidents piled up like firewood. Silas knew when letters would arrive before the mailman came. He spoke about conversations happening miles away with perfect accuracy. He told Ruth about her dreams before she could describe them herself. Mirrors began cracking when he passed them. Not shattering, just developing single hairline cracks that spread like lightning across the glass. Ruth watched it happen 3 times before she removed every mirror from the ground floor. One Sunday at noon, Ruth noticed Silas standing in a beam of direct sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. She stared at the floor beneath him, counting her own heartbeats, feeling her mouth go dry. His shadow stretched long and dark across the wooden planks, but the angle was wrong. The sun came from the east, yet his shadow pointed west, cast by a light source that didn't exist in their world. Ruth turned 23 in 1935, an unmarried woman in a community that had already forgotten she existed. No suitors came calling. No invitations arrived for social gatherings. She had become as invisible as her family, bound to the hollow by something stronger than duty. Love perhaps, or responsibility. Or maybe just the terrible need to understand what her brother was becoming. Silas, now 12, had grown into a quiet, serious boy with dark hair and darker eyes. He read constantly, devouring every book in the house, and most of those Jonathan could borrow from the traveling library. He spoke little, but listened constantly, his attention fixed on conversations and silences with equal intensity. Ruth found him easier to love than fear during daylight hours. He helped her with chores without being asked, never complained, and showed her a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about him. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. And in those moments, he was simply her younger brother, but nights told a different story. Ruth woke one August evening to find her door open, though she clearly remembered latching it. She crept downstairs and discovered Silas standing at the back door in his nightshirt, staring into the darkness of the yard.
"Silas?"
she whispered. "What are you doing?" He didn't turn around. "They're calling me." "Who's calling you?" "The ones who sleep in the ground. They want to show me things." His voice had that strange layered quality she'd heard only once before during Reverend Stone's failed blessing. Ruth approached slowly, her heart pounding. "You need to come back to bed." "I've been to the cemetery 3 times this week," he said matter-of-factly. "I wake up there with dirt under my fingernails. I don't remember walking, but I remember what they tell me." She grabbed his shoulders, turning him to face her. His eyes looked through her rather than at her, focused on something she couldn't see. "What do they tell you?" "How to open doors that should stay closed. How to speak words that unmake things. How to see what's hidden." He blinked, and suddenly his eyes focused on her face. "I'm scared, Ruth. I don't want to know these things, but they fill my head every night like water rising." It was the first time he'd admitted fear, the first crack in whatever mask he'd worn. Ruth pulled him close, feeling him tremble against her. "Has it always been this way?" she asked. "Since I was born. There's a voice that's always there underneath my own thoughts, teaching me, showing me visions." He pulled back, gripping her arms with surprising strength. "Mama made a bargain. During the pregnancy, I heard her tell Papa once when they thought I was sleeping. She was bleeding and afraid she'd lose the baby, so she begged. She didn't care what heard her prayer as long as something answered." Ruth's blood turned cold. She thought of her father's cryptic words years ago, the confession she'd tried to dismiss as drunken rambling. "Something did answer," Silas continued. "And now it won't let go. It's been waiting inside me, Ruth, growing stronger. When I turn 15 on Halloween at midnight, it's going to take what it was promised." "What was it promised?" His face twisted with pain. "Me?" Jonathan Blackwood died on a Tuesday morning in April of 1937, 2 weeks after his 48th birthday. Ruth found him in the barn, sprawled on the hay-covered floor with his eyes wide open and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. There wasn't a mark on him. No blood, no bruising, no sign of struggle. The doctor, who finally agreed to come, a nervous young man from 2 counties over, examined the body with shaking hands and declared it heart failure. But Ruth saw what he refused to acknowledge: the absolute terror frozen into her father's features. The way his fingers were clawed as if trying to fight something off. The unnatural angle of his spine as though he'd been trying to crawl away from something invisible. Silas stood in the barn doorway during the examination, watching with that unnervingly calm expression he wore like a mask. Ruth caught his eye and saw something flicker there. Guilt perhaps, or recognition. "Did you do this?" she whispered after the doctor left. "I didn't touch him," Silas replied, which wasn't an answer at all. Sarah's mind shattered like dropped glass. She attended the funeral in a daze, her lips moving constantly in prayers and phrases that made no sense. That night, Ruth found her mother in Silas's room, kneeling beside his bed, speaking in a rapid stream of consciousness that mixed scripture with apologies with threats. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I didn't mean it. I was bleeding so much blood. The baby was dying. I couldn't let another one die. Not after the 2 I lost before Thomas. Forgive me. I'll do anything. Take me instead. Please. God or devil or whatever heard me that night. Take me instead." Ruth tried to lead her mother to bed, but Sarah fought her with surprising strength. "He needs to be cleansed," Sarah shrieked. "The pastor was right. We should have done it years ago. We should have drowned him in the river and started over. But I loved him too much. I loved my baby boy too much." Silas watched from his bed, his face pale in the lamplight. "I'm sorry, Mama." Sarah's eyes rolled back, and she began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own. Words in a language Ruth had never heard, harsh and ancient. Foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. Her body shook violently. Ruth screamed for help, but there was no one to hear except Silas, who climbed out of bed and approached his mother with something like sorrow in his eyes. "Stop it," he said quietly. "Let her go." Sarah collapsed unconscious. When she woke 3 days later, she could only speak in tongues and biblical verses. Her mind retreated to some place where the horror couldn't reach her. Ruth moved her mother to the downstairs bedroom and tended to her like a child. Sarah would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally bursting into fevered prayers or warnings about the end of days. She recognized no one, not even her own reflection. On the 5th night, Ruth confronted Silas in the kitchen. "What's happening to us?" she demanded. He looked impossibly old for 13, burdened with knowledge no child should carry. "The entity is preparing. It's clearing away obstacles. Papa knew too much. Mama made the deal. Now there's just you and me left." "Why me?" "Because you still love me despite everything. And love is the strongest binding force in any realm." He met her eyes. "I need you to help me break free, Ruth, before Halloween comes again." Ruth found Granny Kate's cabin after 3 hours of searching through overgrown mountain paths she barely remembered from childhood. The old midwife was nearly 90 now, her back bent like a question mark, her eyes clouded with cataracts. She sat on her porch in a rocking chair as if she'd been expecting company. "You're Sarah Blackwood's girl," Granny Kate said before Ruth could speak. "Come about the Halloween child. How did you know?" "Because there's only one reason you'd climb this mountain alone. Because I've been waiting 15 years for someone to come." She pointed to the empty chair beside her. "Sit down. We don't have much time." Ruth's hands trembled as she described everything. The deaths, the speaking in tongues, Silas's confession about the entity that had been growing inside him since birth. Granny Kate listened without interruption, her face carved from stone. "Your mama made a desperate bargain with something old and hungry," Granny Kate finally said. These entities exist between worlds, waiting for invitations. A mother's prayer during a difficult birth, especially a seventh child on Halloween. That's a doorway. The entity gave the child life, but the price was the child himself, a vessel to walk in human flesh. Silas said it would take him on his 15th birthday on Halloween at midnight. That's the completion of the bargain. 15 years of growing, learning, becoming strong enough to fully contain what's been waiting inside him. A Granny Kate reached for Ruth's hand with fingers like dry twigs, but there is a way to break such agreements. Only one way, and it requires terrible sacrifice. She led Ruth inside the cabin, where bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and jars of unidentifiable substances lined the shelves. From a locked chest, she pulled out a leather-bound book so old the pages crumbled at the edges. This was my grandmother's, passed down through 6 generations of mountain women who knew the old ways. Here she pointed to a page covered in careful handwriting and strange symbols. The rite of unbinding. Ruth reads slowly, her stomach churning with each line. The ritual required specific items: salt blessed by 7 churches, water from a graveyard well, silver melted from family heirlooms. It had to be done in a holy space at the exact moment the bargain was made. Midnight on Halloween, and it required blood from the one who loved the cursed child most. The entity feeds on the bond between the vessel and the bargain maker, Granny Kate explained, but love is more powerful than any dark agreement. If someone who truly loves the child offers their blood willingly, and if the child chooses to fight the entity from within, the bond can be broken. What happens to the person who gives their blood? Granny Kate's silence was answer enough. Ruth copied the ritual into her diary with careful detail, memorizing each step, each word of the spell. As she prepared to leave, the old woman gripped her wrist with surprising strength. There's something else you need to know. If the ritual fails, if Sarah interferes, or if the entity is stronger than we hope, it won't just claim Silas. It will be free to walk the earth in human form, and it will remember everyone who tried to stop it. Ruth walked home through the darkening woods, the ritual burning in her memory like a brand. She had 6 months to prepare, 6 months to gather the items, 6 months to accept that saving her brother would likely cost her everything. October 31st, 1938, arrived with unseasonable cold. Ruth had spent 6 months gathering the ritual items, traveling to 7 different churches to beg blessed salt from sympathetic ministers, melting down her grandmother's silver locket, drawing water from the ancient well behind the cemetery where 3 generations of Blackwoods lay buried. The old church stood abandoned a mile from their house, its roof partly collapsed, but its foundation still holy ground. Ruth had swept it clean, arranged candles in the pattern Granny Kate's book specified, and drawn protective circles with the blessed salt. Silas arrived at 1100, wearing the white shirt Ruth had sewn for him. At 14, he stood nearly as tall as their father had been, but he carried himself like someone much older, burdened with knowledge that aged him beyond his years. "Are you ready?" Ruth asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been ready since I understood what I was." He stepped into the inner circle she'd prepared. "Whatever happens tonight, Ruth, know that you gave me the only real kindness I've ever known. You saw what I was and loved me anyway." She wanted to hug him but didn't dare break the circle's wholeness. Instead, she began the ritual, speaking the words she'd memorized, pouring the graveyard water, lighting the candles in order. The temperature dropped with each passing minute. Their breath came out in white clouds. At 11:45, Silas began to change. His body went stiff, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. When he spoke, multiple voices layered together, some human, some definitely not. "You cannot break what was freely given." The mother offered. "We accepted that is owed." Ruth continued the chant, her voice rising to match the wind that had begun howling through the broken roof. She drew the silver blade across her palm, letting her blood drip into the ceremonial bowl, mixing with the holy water. "But blood freely given, by love freely offered, I break this agreement." "Release him!" Silas screamed, his back arching impossibly as the entity fought to keep its hold. Black smoke began seeping from his mouth and nose, taking form in the air above him. Something vast and ancient and furious. The church doors burst open. Sarah stood in the entrance, her eyes wild, her hair loose and tangled. In the months since her breakdown, she'd barely been aware of her surroundings. But tonight, something had pulled her from her daze. "No!" Sarah shrieked. "You can't take my baby. I won't let you. Mama, don't!" But it was too late. Sarah rushed forward, breaking through the salt circle, ruining the carefully drawn symbols. The protective barrier shattered like glass. The entity's smoke gathered, surging toward the break. Silas collapsed, gasping. The entity hovered between forms, neither fully bound nor fully released. The clock began striking midnight, each chime echoing through the church like a death bell. Ruth grabbed her mother, trying to pull her back, but Sarah fought with inhuman strength. The candles exploded one after another, throwing them into darkness, broken only by the entity's sickly glowing light. In the chaos, Ruth heard Silas's voice, young and terrified, and finally completely human. "I'm sorry." Then came the fire, spreading faster than natural flames, eating the old church with hungry speed. Ruth dragged her mother toward the door as beams crashed around them. Behind her, she heard Silas screaming and something else screaming with him. 2 voices merging into one terrible sound. She made it outside just as the roof collapsed. The fire department found 3 bodies in the ruins of the church the next morning. Sarah Blackwood, identifiable by her wedding ring, Silas Blackwood, identified by his age, and the upside-down cross birthmark still visible on charred skin, and a third body that shouldn't have been there. So badly burned that authorities never determined its identity or origin. Ruth survived but never spoke again. The trauma had stolen her voice as completely as if someone had cut it from her throat. She spent the remaining 42 years of her life in a state institution, drawing the same image over and over on any paper she could find, an upside-down cross surrounded by flames. Her diary was discovered in the Blackwood house, ruins 3 weeks after the fire, hidden beneath floorboards that somehow survived the blaze. The local sheriff read it once, went pale and locked it in the evidence room where it gathered dust for decades. The hollow stood empty after that. No one would buy the Blackwood land, and eventually the forest reclaimed it. The house collapsed into itself and the barn rotted into the earth. Locals avoided the area, especially around Halloween when strange lights were sometimes seen dancing through the trees. But the story didn't end in 1938. In October of 1988, exactly 50 years after that Halloween fire, a woman named Jennifer Morrison gave birth in Nashville to a healthy baby boy at midnight. The delivery was routine. The baby perfectly normal by all measures, except for the birthmark on his left shoulder blade. The attending nurse, an older woman who'd grown up hearing mountain legends, dropped her clipboard when she saw it. A perfect upside-down cross, dark as a bruise, identical to the one described in old newspaper articles about the Blackwood tragedy that she'd read as a girl. She said nothing. What could she say that wouldn't sound crazy? But she made note of the date and time in her personal records, and she watched the news for years afterward, waiting for reports of strange occurrences in Nashville. They came. Small things at first, unexplained deaths, animals behaving oddly, a child who spoke in languages he'd never learned, a boy who knew things he couldn't possibly know. Ruth's diary was finally made public in 2003, donated to the Tennessee State Archives by the sheriff's grandson. Researchers and paranormal investigators pored over it, debating whether it was real, arguing over whether the Blackwood case represented genuine supernatural occurrence or shared delusion. But those who read it carefully, who paid attention to the dates and patterns, noticed something chilling in Ruth's final entry, written the morning of October 31st, 1938, hours before the ritual. Granny Kate warned me the entity would remember those who fought it. But she also said something else, something I didn't understand until now. She said, "These ancient things don't die. They only wait. They make bargains across generations. And when one door closes, they simply wait for another desperate soul to open a new one. Every 7th generation, the mark appears. Every Halloween, the debt comes due again." The last line, written in shaking handwriting, read, "God forgive us, we didn't end it, we only delayed it. The Morrison boy turned 36 this year. He has 3 children. The youngest, a girl, is pregnant with her 7th child. The due date is October 31st, 2025. The cycle continues. If this story sent chills down your spine, you're not alone. These dark chapters of history need to be remembered and shared. Click that like button to help us uncover more forgotten tales that blur the line between history and horror. And subscribe, because next week we are diving into another case that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember that some debts echo through generations.